Today we're going to talk about how to go about approaching the assessment task for the Year 8 poetry essay. So I've got written on the board here the question: discuss how effectively poetry captures the changing Australian identity. And then the second half of it says something like refer to 2 poems that you've studied in class. It is okay to do 3 if you like. Some people might prefer that. Either's fine, and doing 2 or 3, it doesn't matter which way you go. Both ways you're able to access the A range and the top marks. You won't be rewarded just for doing a 3rd poem, and I would think that the vast majority of students will only do 2. What we need to do when we look at the essay question is identify the key words. So in this one we've got discuss. We also have how effectively poetry captures the changing Australian identity. And I think they're the 3 things that we really need to look at when we are approaching the question. So first of all, the discuss part of the essay question is asking us to present an argument. And whilst we're presenting that argument, we want to provide a reasonable exploration of the topic. And then what we want to do is we want to support what we're saying with evidence from the poems. So that's when your quotes on your quote page come in. Okay, the next part asks you to say how effectively the poetry does it. So in doing that, if I can do a little squiggly line down through here, we get to the point where the question is asking you to provide some sort of value judgment. So how effectively does poetry portray the changing Australian identity? So they do they do it a lot? Is it very effective in doing that? Is it only moderate, or is it ineffective? Really, that's for you to decide. But generally speaking, I think with a question like this, we're going to argue that it is somewhat very effective, that the poems successfully capture the changing Australian identity, and then we'll tease out through the language use that they've used, how they've done that. Okay, so certainly we have to say how effective it is. And then the third thing that we have to look at is this idea of the changing Australian identity. And so I suppose it's probably a good thing to do is to look for points of difference between the poems. And there are a whole different range of ways you can do that. So two ways you could look at it is with the changing Australian identity. You could look at the difference between the colonial Australian poems and then the modern poems. So you could look at the aspects and the characteristics of the colonial time, and then compare that to how it's changed in the modern time. And in doing that, you'll have to come up with some sort of justifications for your reasoning. Okay, so for the colonial poems such as The Teams and My Country, you could say that there's a sense of patriotism and national pride, and that certainly comes across in My Country. But I think also in The Teams that these Bullockys are working extremely hard in really adverse and lonely sort of environments. They have the desire to actually make Australia a great country and an independent country. Remember that from the colonial times they were separating from being part of the British, not the British Empire, but part of the British, or being identified as British, I suppose. So we could certainly say that they're full of pride and highly patriotic. But we can definitely see in the Teams elements of stoicism. And being stoic is a personality trait where you just get on with the job and you don't complain and you work pretty hard. They certainly persevere and they're very passionate about what they're doing. So what you could do is you could compare that to some of the modern poems like Life Cycle, for example, and look at the difference in the characteristics of the Australian identity and come to some understanding as to why that may have changed. So with a poem like Life Cycle, we could say that the modern Australian identity, the poem presents a lot in a very humorous manner, through exaggeration particularly, but there are a number of elements that we saw that there was a parody of particular things, and there were biblical allusions, a whole range of devices used by Bruce Dorr as a means of presenting Australia in a light-hearted and humorous manner, and it's sort of suggesting that Australians are very easygoing, that we like to laugh at ourselves. We don't take ourselves so seriously. Okay, in that poem too, it sort of presents this idea that we are sport loving, and that is the religion of our society, and that we're born into this life cycle. But there are a number of other poems. You might decide you want to look at Dripping with Decadence and you could look at the colonial sort of aspect of the European settlers and how they tried to tame the bush. And then you could look at Dripping with Decadence and look at the outcome of that. And 200 years on, Aboriginal people are still lamenting their persecution over the years. And you can look at the really positive language in this poem, and then in Dripping with Decadence you could look at the negative imagery and connotations, and really get into a discussion about how our Australian identity has changed, and make some sort of value judgments on that. Another thing that I think is an interesting thing to look at is this idea of Australians being passionate. And you could trace it through both poems. So you could look at one of the early colonial poems and do a body paragraph on it. And I would sort of say we'd write one paragraph generally on the poem and the characteristics that are presented. Then you could write a second paragraph on the other poem, the modern poem. And so you'd have your ideas on that. And then a good way to go about making your poem, your essay on the poetry, a little bit more sophisticated is look for something that links between the two. And so one thing that we could say is that there is both identities from the different eras. They show a passion. So we could do a blended paragraph here where we talk about the two poems, but we focus on the passion, and you could talk about the similarities and differences. So they're both passionate about being Australians, and this one in the colonial period is forging an identity. And then maybe if you looked at a modern poem, you might discover and explore the passion that's evident in the poem, because a lot of them do demonstrate a very strong, passionate voice about what they believe in. So that's a really interesting way to approach it. It's certainly all right too. Obviously we've got an introduction here, and below we'd have our conclusion. It's okay to, we'll make that intro. It's all right to have two paragraphs, if you like, on your first poem, and two paragraphs on your second poem, and then finish off with a conclusion as well. There's no right or wrong model. You might just want to explore the first poem, and then in the second poem you might say similar to the first poem that you looked at, or you might say in contrast to the first poem, and you just make a few little observations about how the identity has changed through making connections to the first poem. So if in the first poem you were saying that there's a really high element of patriotism, you could say this is not. Oh, that one actually would probably be consistent throughout, wouldn't it? That would fit under passion. So it might be the stoic nature that in the first, in the colonial poem, that there is a real stoicism and it's built on hard work. And then in the modern poem, Life Cycle, for example, you might explore and say that the poem is built on leisure and the enjoyment of sport. And so that would be a really interesting way of differentiating between the two. So, basically what we've been doing in class is we've been building our body paragraphs. And so I would imagine at this point you'll have got to the point where you've formed a response to definitely one of your poems, and it's just a matter of doing the same to the other, but really framing it through this question and looking at where the difference between the identity is and what is it that causes it. So I suppose the question is really exploring context, and we're saying, well, in the colonial era, you know, in this time period, the identity was shaped like this for these reasons, and it's changed because our society has evolved. Okay, so when we start our poem, we need to have a thesis, and basically we have to have an overarching statement that says, well, why is it that the Australian identity changed? What made it change? And then from, you know, using that as your main argument throughout the essay, you're going to tease out the differences between the two.